If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear it, the quiet crackle of a fire oven, the soft thud of dough being shaped by tired but steady hands, and the faint sound of early morning birds that probably woke every medieval baker long before sunrise. Bread has always been more than food. It's been comfort, survival, and honestly, the number one thing people argued about before the invention of politics or smartphones. Tonight, we're taking a slow walk into that world, a world where bread wasn't wrapped in plastic, didn't come sliced, and definitely didn't contain ingredients with names that sound like password errors. Medieval bread was simple, warm, and alive. Yes, alive, because sourdough is basically a tiny community of good microbes, and they were doing more work than half the population on a Monday morning. But before we dive into sourdough's superheroes, let's first settle into the setting. Imagine Europe, maybe 1,000 years ago. No factories, no supermarkets, not even one sad loaf sitting in a fridge waiting to grow mold. Instead, every town, village, and little cluster of farm huts had its own baker. Someone who woke up earlier than everyone else, worked harder than everyone else, and probably smelled like warm bread every hour of the day. Honestly, not a bad way to smell. Bread wasn't optional. It wasn't a side dish. It wasn't something you grabbed because you were too lazy to cook. Bread was the main event. Without bread, medieval people wouldn't just be annoyed, they'd be starving. Most families lived on bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they didn't already eat last winter. Meat? Sure, once in a while, if you were rich, lucky, or very good at stealing chickens. So yes, bread was life, and because it was life, people cared deeply about how it was made. They didn't have fancy nutrition labels or calorie counts, but they had something modern bread forgot: real ingredients and time. In the Middle Ages, everything took longer. If you wanted flour, someone had to grow the grain, cut the grain, dry the grain, take it to a mill, grind it between big stone wheels, and hope the miller wasn't cheating by taking too much for himself. Millers had a bad reputation, basically the car mechanics of the medieval world. You'd bring in one bag of grain and somehow leave with half a bag of flour and a confused expression. But even with a sneaky miller, people usually ended up with flour that still had all the good stuff in it: the bran, the germ, the natural oils, all the parts modern mills throw away like they're cleaning out a closet. And that's one big reason medieval bread was healthier. It still had all the nutrients the grain came with. Today's flour often gets stripped of everything, then fortified by adding some nutrients back in. It's like destroying a house and rebuilding only one room. But back to our time machine. Picture a medieval household on baking day. The dough sits in a wooden bowl covered with cloth. There's no timer, no thermometer, no YouTube tutorial called "How to Fix Bread Dough When It Misbehaves." They trusted their eyes, hands, and the smell of yeast doing its slow little dance. People had been baking for thousands of years after all. They knew what they were doing. And because everything was done slowly, grinding, mixing, fermenting, the bread was gentle on the stomach. It was filling, but not bloating, heavy, but in a good way. The kind of bread that villagers carried to the fields, knights carried on long rides, monks ate in silent dining halls, and families shared at the end of a long day. Bread wasn't something they rushed. They had no reason to. Time was different then. Days moved slower, and so did people. You couldn't hurry fermentation. You couldn't tell your bread dough to work faster or it was getting replaced. Bread rose when it wanted to, and when it did, it had layers of flavor modern bread can only dream of. Now, imagine someone from the Middle Ages tasting today's bread. First, they'd poke it because it's too soft and too fluffy, almost suspiciously fluffy. Then they'd look at the list of ingredients and probably think we invented a new language. Bread today often has chemicals to make it last longer, rise faster, stay softer, look whiter, additives that medieval bakers would have stared at like, what is this sorcery? But we'll get to that part later. Imagine walking through a medieval town early in the morning. The sky is still a pale blue, mist floating low over cobblestone streets. People are just waking up, pulling on wool clothes that never quite get fully dry in winter. You follow the warm smell of fresh bread. It's everywhere. Bakers are pulling out huge round loaves with thick crusts and soft, chewy centers. No loaf looks the same. They're all imperfect, rustic, and full of character. Some loaves are made with wheat, some with rye, some with barley, some a mix of anything the harvest gave them. People didn't waste grain. If it grew, it went into bread. And the bread reflected life itself. Simple, honest, sometimes rough, sometimes surprisingly delicious. The people eating it might not have been rich, but their bread was. Rich in nutrients, rich in fiber, rich in the kind of slow energy that kept farmers swinging tools from sunrise to sunset, and rich in tradition, recipes passed down not by writing, but by watching mothers, grandmothers, and neighbors working dough with patient hands. If you could peek into a medieval home during breakfast, you'd quickly notice something funny. The table might look a little empty. No cereal, no buttered toast, no fancy yogurt cups with shiny foil lids. Just bread. Maybe a chunk of cheese if the family was lucky. Maybe some ale, which honestly worked like medieval coffee. But bread was always there. That's because in the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just food. Bread was survival, status, comfort, and currency, all rolled into one warm loaf. People didn't ask, "What should we eat today?" They asked, "Do we have enough bread?" And if the answer was no, well, that was a real problem. Medieval people stressed about bread the way modern people stress about their Wi-Fi connection dropping during a movie. Bread meant everything. It fed families, fueled workers, and carried the weight of both rich and poor. And depending on who you were in this old world, lord, monk, merchant, or peasant, your bread said a lot about your life. If you were wealthy, your bread was made from the best sifted wheat. Light, pale, soft, the kind of loaf you'd brag about if Instagram had existed. People even had names for these fancy breads, like manchet, which sounds like a tiny sword, but was actually a soft white roll the upper class adored. But if you weren't rich, and let's be honest, most medieval people weren't, the story changed. Your bread was darker, rougher, and heavier. Rye bread was common, barley bread, mixed grain bread, sometimes bread made from whatever the harvest gave you, even if that meant peas, beans, or oats. There was even a type of bread called maslin, made from a mix of wheat and rye. Think of it as the medieval version of whatever's in the pantry bread. The funny thing is, the rich thought their white bread was the best, because it looked clean and pure. But the darker breads the poor people ate, they were actually way healthier. More fiber, more minerals, more actual grain. Meanwhile, the nobles were basically eating medieval junk food without knowing it. The peasants didn't get the luxury life, but they got the better bread. Bread wasn't just food, though. It was woven into community life. Imagine a village where everyone knows when baking day is. Smoke rises from chimneys, children run around carrying small bits of leftover dough like tiny chefs. People gossip near the communal oven because, yes, many villages had one oven everyone shared. It's basically the first version of community cooking spaces, except hotter, smokier, and with more arguments about whose loaf burned last week. Bread also had rules, serious rules. Kings and town councils often made laws about how bread should be priced, how much a loaf should weigh, and what ingredients bakers were allowed to use. If a baker cheated by making loaves too small or messing with the grain, they could be punished in creative medieval ways, like being forced to sit in public humiliation devices or having their bad bread displayed for everyone to laugh at. Imagine being roasted by an entire village over a loaf of bread. Brutal. But all this shows how important bread was to society. You messed with bread, you messed with the whole community. Bread also played huge roles in religion. In churches and monasteries, bread symbolized spiritual ideas, unity, generosity, and tradition. Monks made some of the finest bread of the time, carefully baked, sometimes flavored with herbs or honey, and always shaped with meaning. They believed every loaf was a gift, and every meal was a moment to slow down and be grateful. Meanwhile, peasants out in the countryside weren't thinking so deeply about symbolism. They were thinking about how far this bread had to last. Bread had to stretch. Sometimes it had to carry an entire family through long winters when fresh food didn't exist. Bread was stored, dried, dunked in soups, crumbled into stews, and eaten in dozens of ways. You didn't throw old bread away. No one even imagined such a thing. There were years when harvests failed, and bread became scarce. People mixed in anything they could find to stretch out the flour. Nuts, roots, even ground up tree bark in truly desperate times. And while that wasn't exactly delicious, it was a reminder of how central bread was. When things got bad, you didn't ask for meat or fruit, you asked for flour. And still, even in the hardest years, bread brought people together. Families gathered around it, workers took a chunk with them into the fields, travelers carried loaves for long journeys, soldiers marched with bread rations. Bread was a friend, a companion, and sometimes the only steady thing in unstable times. It also shaped culture in softer ways. When someone shared bread with you, it meant trust. When neighbors baked together, it meant unity. When the smell of fresh loaves filled a marketplace, it meant life was moving forward, even if slowly. Imagine sitting at a long wooden table, a single lantern glowing, kids half asleep from a long day of chores. The mother breaks a loaf and passes it around. Everyone dips their piece in broth or spreads a little cheese if they're lucky. It's quiet, simple, and strangely peaceful. Bread wasn't just survival. It was the center of the home. And if you look even deeper, bread shaped how medieval people thought about fairness and community. They believed everyone deserved bread, even the poorest people. So when leaders messed with grain prices or taxed flour too heavily, the whole town could erupt in protests. Bread riots were real. People didn't fight for gold, they fought for bread. That's how essential it was. But here's the gentle truth. Even with all this importance attached to it, bread was comforting. It was the food people returned to when life got too heavy. The smell, the warmth, the way it filled the stomach, it all made the world feel just a little safer. Today we think of bread as just one option among thousands. Back then, bread was the anchor. It shaped their days, their work, their memories, their celebrations, and even their fears. If you've ever stood in a modern grocery store staring at shelves of flour, you might have noticed something strange. Every bag looks the same. Same white powder, same texture, same enriched label printed like a guilty confession. But if you went back to the Middle Ages and asked someone for flour, they'd probably laugh, because medieval flour wasn't one thing. It came in all kinds of colors and moods. The grains they used were different too, stronger, wilder, more personal, like the medieval version of choosing your own Pokemon. Tonight we're stepping into the fields. Not modern ones, smooth and perfect. These are medieval fields. Patchy, stubborn, full of weeds that grow like they got invited. Farmers back then didn't always plant neat rows. They didn't have fancy chemicals or machines. They had muscle, sweat, stubborn hope, and maybe a mule with questionable motivation. And from these honest little fields came the grains that made medieval bread so impressive. The most important grain was wheat, but not the wheat we eat today. Medieval wheat was taller, with long golden stalks that waved like they were greeting the entire countryside. The grains were smaller but richer, more fiber, more minerals, more nutrients. These older varieties had names that sound like characters from a fantasy novel: emmer, einkorn, and spelt. Farmers didn't grow them because it sounded cool. They grew them because these grains survived almost anything. Storms, dry seasons, hungry insects, whatever challenge nature threw at them. Einkorn, for example, is one of the oldest grains humans ever grew. It tastes nutty, smells warm, and is full of vitamins. Ammer was another old friend, harder to grow, but powerful in nutrition. Spelt was the tough one, strong, reliable, the kind of grain you'd want on your medieval soccer team. And all of these grains were full of nutrients modern wheat doesn't always have anymore. But medieval bread wasn't only made from wheat. Rye was extremely popular, especially in colder northern areas where wheat didn't grow well. Rye is a tough grain. It just shrugs at bad weather. Rain? Cool. Snow? Even better. Soil that isn't great? No problem. Rye doesn't complain. And because it was so easy to grow, rye fed entire villages for centuries. Bread made from rye was darker, heavier, and denser. The kind of bread that could knock someone out if you threw it hard enough. But it was healthy, really healthy. It didn't spike sugar levels the way modern white bread does. It lasted longer. It had flavor, depth, and a kind of quiet confidence. Medieval people didn't care that it looked dark. They cared that it kept them alive through long winters. Barley was another common grain. Barley bread wasn't the softest or the fluffiest, but it was honest and filling. Barley was cheap, and that made it the hero for poorer families. It was used in bread, soups, and even beer. Actually, beer was sometimes safer than water, but we'll save that adventure for another night. Sometimes medieval bakers mixed grains together, creating blends like maslin, which was part wheat, part rye. It wasn't fancy, but it was reliable. These mixed breads were full of fiber and nutrients, and they didn't cause the kind of stomach drama modern bread sometimes does. There were no genetically altered grains, no high-yield dwarf wheat, no modern breeding techniques that sometimes made grains stronger but less nutritious. Everything was natural, slow-growing, and rich with minerals from the soil. Another funny thing, medieval grain had personality. Because each farm had its own soil, weather, and quirks, every harvest tasted slightly different. One year, the wheat might be sweeter. Another year, the rye might be richer. People knew their fields the way we know our favorite coffee order. They understood the land and what it gave them. And the best part, medieval grains were complete. When they were milled, the bran and germ, the most nutritious parts, stayed in the flour. Today, those parts are often removed to make flour look whiter and last longer. Imagine taking a perfect fruit, removing the skin, juice, fiber, and most of the vitamins, leaving only the pale center, and calling it enriched after sprinkling a few nutrients back on top. That's basically modern flour. Medieval flour wasn't like that. It was whole. It had color. It had texture. It was alive with natural oils that made dough rich and flavorful. Bread made from it was hearty and grounding, not airy and empty like some modern loaves. Because grains were so important, people treated them with respect. Harvest season was a big deal. The whole village worked together, cutting, gathering, tying bundles, loading carts. It was messy, sweaty, and probably smelled like a mix of earth, hay, and body odor. But it was joyful, too. Kids ran around chasing chickens, dogs stole dropped grain. Farmers shouted instructions like they were directing an orchestra of chaos. And when the harvest was done, life felt secure. People even had superstitions about grains. They believed certain fields were blessed, and some said spirits protected the crops. They whispered about grain spirits hiding in the last sheaf of the harvest. And because kneeling in dirt for 12 hours a day could make anyone emotional, they sometimes decorated that last bundle like it was a little doll and kept it through winter. They said it protected next year's harvest. Honestly, kind of cute. But the most surprising thing is this. Medieval bread was healthier because their grains were healthier. Not engineered, not highly processed, not stripped of nutrients. Just grown slowly, harvested carefully, and ground by stones that didn't destroy the grain's natural goodness. If you brought a loaf of medieval bread into a modern bakery today, people would stare at it. They'd probably think something like, "Whoa, that looks heavy," or "Is that bread or a weapon?" But that dense, rugged, imperfect loaf was full of life. It was fuller in every sense. More fiber, more minerals, more real food in every bite. These grains powered farmers who worked from sunrise to sunset. They fueled soldiers who marched for miles. They fed children who grew strong even in tough times. And all of that came from plants that didn't look perfect, didn't grow quickly, and didn't need human inventions to survive. As you relax here, imagine walking through one of those medieval fields, tall wheat brushing your hands, the soft sound of wind moving through long stalks, a farmer in the distance waving at you, probably wondering why you're strolling through his crops like you're on a relaxing vacation. But that's the charm of old grains. They slow you down, they remind you that food once came from quiet places, not factories. Imagine carrying a big sack of freshly harvested grain on your back, not a small bag like the ones we get today, a full sack that probably weighs more than a modern gym membership guild. Villagers would bring their grain to the local mill, usually located near a river or stream. Why the river? Because medieval people were smart. They used water power to turn massive stone wheels. No electricity, no engines, just flowing water pushing wooden gears and heavy stone discs around and around all day long. As you get close to the mill, you hear it before you see it, a deep, steady rumble. The sound of stone grinding against stone, the old wooden wheel turning in the rushing water, birds flying away because the noise is too much for their little ears, and the miller. Yes, we have to talk about the miller. Millers had a reputation, not always a good one. People thought they cheated customers by accidentally taking a little extra grain or keeping a bit too much flour as payment. Some villages joked that millers had pockets deeper than a knight's stomach. But even with the suspicion, millers were important. They knew how to handle the machinery, how to adjust the stones, how to keep the grain from burning during grinding. And trust me, you didn't want burnt flour. That would ruin your bread for days. Inside the mill, everything is dusty. Flour dust floats in the air like tiny snowflakes. It sticks to your clothes, your hair, your eyelashes. If you stood there for 20 minutes, you'd look like a ghost who makes sandwiches. The ground vibrates under your feet as the huge millstones spin, crushing grain between them with incredible force. But here's the magical part. Because the grinding stones moved slowly and naturally, they didn't heat the grain too much. Modern roller mills spin at high speed, creating heat that removes nutrients and damages natural oils. Medieval mills weren't like that. They were slow, steady, and cool. They kept all the minerals and vitamins intact. It's funny, medieval technology looks old-fashioned, but in some ways it was better for your health. And those stones? They were powerful. The top stone rotated while the bottom one stayed still. Grain was poured through a hole in the center, and as the stones rubbed together, they cracked the grain open, bit by bit, turning it into flour. Not the soft, superfine white flour we see today. Medieval flour had texture. It had personality. You could feel small bits of bran and germ in it, tiny specks that told you, hey, I'm still alive. I still have something to offer. This wasn't whole wheat as a marketing term. This was whole wheat because that's just how things were. Every part of the grain was there. The bran with its fiber, the germ with its natural oils, and the endosperm with its energy. These parts worked together like a little health team. The bread made from this flour was heavier and darker, but it fed people in real ways. Sometimes the mill would even grind tiny bits of the grinding stone into the flour. Not on purpose, just because the stones wore down. It wasn't harmful. It actually added minerals like iron and magnesium into the diet. Imagine getting healthier because your bread accidentally had tiny rock vitamins. Modern nutritionists would probably sigh with envy. When the flour finally turned into flour, villagers packed it up and carried it back home. It wasn't perfectly sifted. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't identical every time. Some batches had more bran, some had bigger specks, some smelled nuttier depending on the grain. Medieval people accepted these differences because they knew that real food didn't always look the same. And now comes the best part. Sifting. Medieval households had coarse sieves made of cloth or horsehair. If you wanted slightly finer flour, you sifted it yourself. But many families didn't bother. They liked it rustic. It made the bread stronger, more filling, and more nutritious. Only the wealthy sifted flour to get whiter bread. And even that wasn't pure white. It was just less brown. The poor didn't waste anything. All the flour, every speck, went into the dough. And because the flour was whole and full of natural oils, it produced bread that filled the stomach and fueled long days of work. This flour didn't dissolve into mush like modern white bread. It stayed firm. It carried weight. And here's something calming to imagine. A medieval mother opening her flour sack at home. The flour is warm because it was freshly milled. It smells earthy, nutty, rich. She touches it, feeling the texture, a mix of smooth powder and tiny flakes. She knows it's good. She knows it's real. And she knows it will feed her family through the week. This flour was more than an ingredient. It was a link between the land, the farmer, the mill, and the home. Every step took time. Every step took effort. No shortcuts, no bleaching, no additives, no chemicals hiding inside long scientific names. Just grain, stone, water, and patience. When the flour was ready, it went straight into the dough bowl. No plastic packaging, no expiration date. Medieval people didn't worry about flour going bad because they used it quickly, and it still contained natural oils that kept it flavorful. If you close your eyes, you can imagine the mill slowly quieting down as the sun sets, the wheel turning a little slower, birds returning, the miller sweeping up flour he'll be finding in his shoes for the next 10 years, and villagers walking home with sacks of fresh flour on their shoulders, steps steady, minds calm. All right, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting deeper into the quiet fields of the Middle Ages, where the grains themselves, tiny, humble, and ancient, help explain why medieval bread was basically the superfood of its time. If medieval people could see today's bread aisle, they'd probably stare at it the way we stare at tax forms, confused, scared, and slightly betrayed. So let's settle in, get cozy, and talk about the grains that made medieval bread so good, and why our modern grains aren't exactly doing us any favors. Let's start with the star of the medieval show, ancient wheat varieties. Back then, people used grains like emmer, einkorn, and spelt. Now, these names sound like characters from a fantasy novel. Einkorn the brave, spelt the mighty. But they were real, and more importantly, they were packed with nutrients. These grains had higher protein, more minerals, and a sturdier structure that made them easier on the stomach. Modern wheat, on the other hand, has been bred like a racehorse, fast-growing, big yield, and able to survive almost anything, except, apparently, being nutritious. Over the last 100 years, wheat has been modified over and over to increase production. Farmers wanted more grain per acre, and scientists made it happen. The catch? Every time they made wheat better for farming, it quietly became worse for humans. Now, medieval farmers didn't care about high-gluten bread rising like a birthday cake. They weren't baking fancy pastries or giant fluffy loaves. They wanted something hearty, bread that could last a few days, survive a long winter, and fill your stomach. And their ancient grains delivered exactly that. These old grains had lower gluten levels, which is something many people today would appreciate. Modern wheat, especially varieties like hard red wheat, has gluten that acts like a super-strength elastic band. That's great for making tall, soft bread, but not so great for people's digestion. Medieval grain also had deeper root systems. That means they pulled more minerals out of the soil: iron, zinc, magnesium, and all those good things your body actually needs. Modern wheat? Short roots, shallow soil reach, lower nutrients. It's basically the difference between a deep, wise medieval monk and a teenager who refuses to get off the couch. But let's talk farming, because that's where things start to really split. In the Middle Ages, fields took breaks. Medieval farmers used crop rotations and fallow years, letting the earth rest. Imagine if you could take a year off work and still have your job safely waiting. That's what medieval soil got. Because the soil rested, it stayed full of life. Worms, microbes, nutrients, and in return, the grains were richer too. Modern industrial farming? No breaks. Ever. We push the soil non-stop, squeezing every last bit of life out of it until fields run on artificial fertilizers like an energy drink. Sure, crops grow fast and in huge amounts, but they grow like junk food. Big, but empty. Then there's the issue of pesticides and herbicides. Medieval grain grew wild and tough. They didn't need chemicals. They fought their own battles against bugs and weeds, like tiny armored knights. Modern wheat? Let's just say it gets a lot of help, and some of those chemicals make their way into the flour we eat. Another big point is that medieval grain was whole, and I mean whole. The grain, the bran, the germ, the fiber, all of it went into the mill and came out the other side. Nothing was removed. Modern grains? We remove almost everything good during milling, then add a little back and brag about enriched flour. That's like stealing someone's car, giving them back the steering wheel and saying, "Look, I upgraded it." But maybe the biggest difference is this. Medieval grain wasn't standardized. Every farm grew slightly different grains based on climate, soil, and tradition. This meant variety, and variety is incredibly good for your gut. Modern wheat is basically one or two varieties grown everywhere. That lack of diversity makes our guts less adaptable. There's also the processing itself. Medieval grain was stone ground. Slow, gentle, slightly warm, but never hot enough to damage nutrients. Stone milling keeps more fiber, oils, and minerals in the flour. Today's industrial roller mills, on the other hand, use high-speed steel rollers that heat up and destroy delicate nutrients. They strip the bran and germ away, leaving behind a sad, pale powder that we call flour, but feels more like a ghost of what flour used to be. And here's the funny part. Most medieval people didn't choose these grains for health reasons. They didn't know about gluten or fiber or antioxidants. They just used what nature gave them. Nature, being the quiet genius it is, gave them the perfect mix. So why does all this matter? Because when you bite into modern bread and feel bloated or sluggish or weirdly tired, it's not your imagination. You're eating a grain that has less nutrition, more gluten, fewer minerals, and more processing. And that's before we even get into how the actual bread is made. But medieval bread started with medieval grain, real grain. Heavy, earthy, living grain that had personality. Grain that grew with the seasons, not in a chemical haze. Grain that fed millions, kept people strong for physical labor, and didn't cause nearly the level of digestion issues we see today. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a secret recipe. It was just ancient varieties, grown in ancient ways, processed with ancient tools. And somehow, that simple approach made all the difference. So the next time you see modern bread boasting made with ancient grains, just remember the Middle Ages didn't call them ancient grains. They just called it bread. And honestly, they had the better deal. All right, get comfortable, because tonight we're sliding quietly into the world of medieval flour making. It sounds simple, right? Just grind some grain and boom, flour. But in the Middle Ages, it was a whole experience. A slow, earthy, hands-on process that produced flour so wholesome, your gut would probably stand up and applaud. So let's drift back to those old village mills, where water wheels creaked, stones hummed, and flour floated in the air like gentle, sleepy snow. First, picture a medieval mill. Nothing shiny, no steel, no electricity. Just a big wooden building with a giant wheel outside, turning slowly as the river pushed through it. Every creak, every splash, every thump would echo across the village. People didn't need alarms. They knew morning had begun when the mills started rumbling. Inside, everything was driven by two massive millstones. These stones were rough, heavy, and carved with little grooves called furrows. The top stone would turn, the bottom stone would stay still, and the grain would slowly pass between them, crushed, cracked, and ground into soft flour. Now, here's the important part. The grinding was slow, really slow. This wasn't a high-speed industrial blur like today's roller mills that spin so fast the flour heats up. Medieval grinding was more like a gentle massage, soft, steady, rhythmic. The stones didn't get hot enough to burn the grain or destroy nutrients. Everything stayed intact. The flour that came out wasn't white or fluffy or perfect. It was slightly coarse, speckled with bits of bran and germ. And guess what? That's where the nutrients live. Iron, magnesium, fiber, oils, all the most important stuff. Nothing was removed. Nothing was refined. Because they weren't trying to make flawless pastries. They were just trying to eat. People also didn't obsess over flour textures like we do now. Today we have bread flour, cake flour, pastry flour, all-purpose flour, enriched flour, bleached flour. It's enough to make a baker cry. Medieval folks had one kind, flour. It came from the mill, you used it, you ate it, and no one argued with it. Another big difference, medieval flour went rancid faster. Not because it was bad, but because it still had the natural oils from the germ. Modern flour lasts for months because they remove everything that can spoil. But medieval people didn't need long shelf life. Their flour was alive, oily, rich, and meant to be eaten fresh. Even the process of getting the flour was a whole community moment. Families would carry sacks of grain to the mill, chat with neighbors, wait their turn, and go home with warm, freshly ground flour. No plastic bags, no supermarket shelves. Just the miller, the stones, and centuries-old routines. Now, before the flour even reached the mill, it had to be cleaned. Medieval people did this by winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so the wind could blow away dust and chaff. It probably looked like a slow-motion dance, grain floating up, breeze whisking the light stuff away, heavier kernels falling back. Simple, but smart. The grains themselves weren't chemically treated. No desiccants, no preservatives, no sprays to keep insects away. If something got into the grain, well, you just picked it out, or ignored it. Medieval guts were stronger than ours. The millstones also added tiny bits of rock minerals to the flour. Not enough to break your teeth, just little traces of stone, rich in minerals like silica and iron. Today that would get the company sued. Back then, it was basically free supplements. Another thing medieval people did that we rarely even think about, sieving. After grinding, they could sift the flour through different-sized cloths to get finer or coarser flour, depending on what they were making. But even the finest medieval flour still had bits of bran. White flour, the kind we know today, was not normal, and it wasn't affordable for most people. Only the wealthy ate superfine white bread. And ironically, their fancy bread was less healthy. The poor ate the heavy, whole-grain stuff. And guess who ended up healthier? Yep, the peasants. Medieval nutrition was kind of an accident, but a happy one. And here's something funny. Millers were both respected and mistrusted. People admired them because they basically fed the whole community, but they also suspected them of cheating, adding chalk, sand, or extra bran to increase the weight of flour. So medieval bread sometimes crunched in a way bread shouldn't crunch. At least their version of food fraud involved natural stuff, not the chemicals we deal with today. But even with the occasional questionable miller, the flour was still more wholesome than ours. It had depth, character, life, because medieval milling didn't strip the grain of its soul. Meanwhile, modern flour is made in steel roller mills that separate everything. Bran over here, germ over there, endosperm in the middle. Then they bleach it, age it, enrich it with artificial vitamins, and sell it to us like it's the best thing ever. Medieval flour, you poured grain between two giant stones and said, "Good enough." And honestly, it was. The magic of medieval flour wasn't in some special technique. It was in what they didn't do. They didn't speed it up. They didn't refine it. They didn't bleach it. They didn't strip the life out of it. They kept the grain whole. They kept the process simple. And that simplicity gave medieval bread a nutritional power modern bread can only dream of. All right, tuck yourself in again, because tonight we're wandering straight into a medieval kitchen. Warm fire glowing, pots bubbling, and bread dough rising slowly like it's stretching after a long nap. Medieval bread making wasn't fancy, it wasn't rushed, and it definitely wasn't filled with 47 mysterious ingredients you can't pronounce. It was simple, earthy, and honestly, kinda genius. So let's ease into the world of medieval bakers, where the loaves were heavy, the flavors were deep, and the process was slow in the best possible way. The first thing you need to understand about medieval bread making is this. They didn't measure anything. Not a single thing. No cups, no grams, no timers. The typical medieval baker didn't say, this dough needs 300 milliliters of water. Nope. They just poured until it felt right. If the dough stuck to everything like glue, too much water. If it crumbled like sad sand, too little. And somehow, their bread still turned out good. Most bread started with freshly milled flour, still warm from the stone mill. The flour had that sweet, nutty smell, the kind you never get from a plastic bag at the supermarket. They would dump it into a big wooden trough, add water, sprinkle some salt, and mix it by hand. No mixers, no dough hooks, just hands, patience, and probably a lot of complaining. The kneading wasn't fancy either. Medieval kneading was more like wrestling. Push, fold, maybe punch it a little if you were having a bad day. Bread making was basically therapy. Now here's where things get interesting. Leavening. Medieval bakers didn't have those neat little packets of yeast you buy today. They relied on something alive, mysterious, sometimes moody. Sourdough. Sourdough starters were passed down like family treasures. If your grandmother gave you her starter, you protected that thing like it was gold. Because if it died, well, no bread for you. Medieval starters were simple mixes of flour and water left out to capture wild yeasts floating in the air. No one really understood the science behind it, they just knew it worked. And yes, sometimes a starter would get a little too sour, too bubbly, too weird, but medieval people handled it like champs. Ah, yes, my starter is possessed today. Lovely. Then they baked the bread anyway. After mixing the dough and adding the living sourdough starter, the dough had to rise. And this is where medieval bread really shines. Slow fermentation. Dough sat for hours, sometimes overnight. Slow rise, gentle bubbles, deep flavor. The gluten in the dough broke down naturally, making the bread easier to digest. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't forced. It was patient. Modern bread rises in about an hour because we pump it full of supercharged yeast and additives. Medieval dough rose at the pace of a sleepy snail, and our stomachs honestly prefer the snail method. Once the dough rose, it was shaped into big, round loaves. None of these perfect rectangles like modern sandwich bread. Medieval loaves looked like big stones, which is sort of funny because when they got old, they basically turned into stones. Now let's talk about the ovens, because this might be the coolest part. Medieval ovens weren't metal boxes with buttons. They were giant stone or clay domes heated by fire. You'd burn wood inside the oven until the walls got blazing hot. Then you'd scrape out the ashes, sweep the floor, sprinkle a little flour to see if it burned too fast, and finally, slide in the dough using long wooden paddles. These ovens retained heat like crazy. They baked bread evenly, slowly, with dry, smoky warmth that gave loaves a thick crust. You know that crispy, crackling sound when you tear fresh bread? Medieval people heard that all the time. There was also a whole community rhythm to it. Many villages shared one oven. Families lined up with their dough, waited their turn, chatted, gossiped, and sometimes argued about whose loaf got too close to someone else's loaf. Bread drama was real. Inside the oven, the dough transformed, not with chemicals or dough conditioners or preservatives, just heat, time, and wild yeast doing its quiet magic. The rising was natural, the crust was natural, the flavor was deep and earthy, and the bread, dense, dark, slightly sour, was surprisingly filling. You didn't need 6 slices. One or two kept you going for hours. Another thing medieval bakers understood instinctively was moisture. Their loaves weren't dry because the whole grains held on to water. The bran, the germ, the natural oils, they kept the bread tender, not soft and fluffy like modern sandwich bread, but moist and chewy, the kind of bread you actually had to bite, not squish between your fingers. Here's something funny. Medieval bread often had fingerprints baked into it. People would mark their loaves with little codes, lines, crosses, tiny symbols so they wouldn't mix them up in the communal oven. Bakers sometimes use wooden stamps, while others just press their thumb into the dough. Imagine that today, buying bread with someone's fingerprint on it. Absolutely not. But back then, totally normal. Even the ingredients were honest. Flour, water, salt, occasionally herbs, maybe some honey if you were lucky. No fake colors, no preservatives, no weird things called improvers. The only improver they had was time. And because the bread was so real, so unprocessed, it fed people in a way modern bread just can't. It filled the stomach, but it also nourished. It didn't cause that heavy, bloated feeling millions of people experience today. It didn't spike blood sugar like a rocket. It was slow food, in every sense of the word. Even when bread went stale, medieval people reused it. They soaked it in broth, turned it into puddings, or used it as a thickener in stews. Medieval kitchens hated waste. A loaf could feed a family for days, even when it was rock hard. You could literally sharpen a knife on old bread, and yet it still had value. So why does all this matter? Because the process, slow, simple, patient, created bread that worked with the body, not against it. Medieval bread wasn't pretending to be healthy, it just was, a product of real grain, real time, and real techniques. Modern bread tries to imitate it with fancy labels like artisanal, rustic, farmhouse style. But medieval people didn't need those labels. Their bread just naturally had all the things we now pay extra for. And the most interesting part, medieval bread wasn't special. It was normal, every day, ordinary. Yet it nourished millions and kept them going through hard labor, cold winters, and long lives. Sometimes simple really is smarter. All right, settle back, breathe slowly, and let's dive into what really made medieval bread extraordinary. Slow fermentation. This is where the magic happened. The invisible process that transformed simple flour and water into something alive, flavorful, and surprisingly healthy. And if you're ready, we'll do it in a way that's calm, gentle, and maybe even a little funny. Modern bread often rises fast. We buy packets of yeast that promise, your bread will double in an hour. People love that. Quick, convenient, no waiting. But here's the thing. Speed comes with a cost. Quick rise bread lacks depth. It lacks flavor. It can also be harder on the stomach. Medieval bakers didn't have any of that. No packets, no timers, no instant solutions. They relied on wild yeast, the invisible critters floating in the air, clinging to flour, dust, and everything else in the room. Yeast in the Middle Ages wasn't uniform. It was unpredictable, moody, and alive. That meant dough sometimes rose faster, sometimes slower. Bakers had to watch, feel, and smell their dough like it was a pet with moods. This unpredictability forced patience. Dough would sit for hours, sometimes overnight. Sourdough starters, passed down through generations, contained communities of yeast and bacteria that worked together slowly, creating tiny bubbles, tangy flavors, and bread that was easy to digest. Unlike modern bread, which rises quickly but leaves you bloated, medieval bread fermented at a pace your stomach could actually handle. Imagine a dough bowl sitting in a corner of the kitchen, sunlight filtering through a small window. The air smells earthy, nutty, slightly sweet. Tiny bubbles form under the surface. The dough swells slowly, quietly, almost like it's breathing. That's slow fermentation at work. It's gentle, it's alive, and your ancestors trusted it, even though they had no idea why it worked. The bacteria in sourdough don't just make flavor, they pre-digest parts of the grain. They break down proteins and complex carbohydrates, making bread more digestible. In modern terms, sourdough is like a personal digestive assistant built into your bread. Medieval people didn't need science to tell them this. They just felt lighter and healthier after eating it. Slow fermentation also made the bread last longer. Freshly baked medieval loaves were heavy and dense, but the acidity created by fermentation prevented mold from forming quickly. People could store bread for several days without worrying about it turning into a science experiment. In winter, when fresh bread wasn't always easy to bake daily, this made a huge difference. And let's not forget flavor. Modern quick-rise bread is often soft, bland, and a little sad. Slow fermented bread, on the other hand, is complex. It has tang, nuttiness, subtle sweetness, and a thick crust that crunches in a satisfying way. Each loaf is a little different because the yeast is alive and interacting with the environment. Medieval people got a loaf that was not just food, but experience. Fermentation was also tied to rhythm. Baking wasn't rushed. Dough rose when it wanted. Bakers learned the seasons, the weather, and the moods of their starters. They knew that dough in winter might take longer to rise. They knew humidity mattered. They observed, adapted, and let the process take its time. Think of it like meditation. The dough teaches patience. You watch, you feel, you wait, and in return you get something nourishing, complex, and reliable. Another interesting fact: fermentation reduced anti-nutrients. Many grains contain phytic acid, which can prevent your body from absorbing minerals like iron and zinc. Slow fermentation naturally breaks down phytic acid, making nutrients more available. In other words, medieval bread wasn't just filling, it was feeding your body efficiently. Modern bread rarely does this because quick rise methods don't allow time for that transformation. Humorously, bakers sometimes had little tricks to help the dough along. They'd place it near the fire to stay warm, or cover it with cloths, or even whisper encouraging words. Well, maybe not whisper, but they definitely checked it obsessively. Every bubble, every fold, every tiny smell was important. They treated dough like it had a personality, because, in a way, it did. And here's a bedtime thought. That same loaf of bread that sat rising slowly in a dark kitchen centuries ago is essentially the same process we call artisan bread today. But unlike modern artisan bread, it wasn't a trend, a brand, or a photo on Instagram. It was survival, health, and tradition, quietly happening every day. So, slow fermentation was the secret medieval bakers didn't need to explain. It created flavor, enhanced nutrition, aided digestion, and prolonged shelf life, all with nothing more than time, patience, and living yeast. Imagine sitting at the table after a long day of work. You break off a chunk of this slowly fermented bread, the crust crunches, the inside is soft, slightly tangy. You dip it into a stew or pour ale over it. It fills you. It comforts you. It sustains you. That's what slow fermentation gave people. Not just bread, but life. And that's why when you compare medieval bread to modern bread, the difference isn't just ingredients, it's time itself. Modern bread is rushed. Medieval bread waited. It allowed life, flavor, and nutrition to develop at a pace that your body and mind could appreciate. As you drift closer to sleep, picture a warm loaf resting on a wooden table. The dough has risen, stretched, and transformed over hours. The air smells faintly sweet and earthy. Outside, the village is quiet. A baker smiles as they slide the loaf into the oven. Time has worked its magic. Silently, slowly, perfectly. First, picture the oven itself. Most villages didn't have a fancy oven in every home. Instead, they had communal ovens, big, dome-shaped clay or stone structures that could hold dozens of loaves at once. The oven wasn't heated by electricity or gas, of course. Nope. They used wood fires, which they burned inside the oven chamber to heat the walls and floor. The process started early in the day. Bakers would light a roaring fire inside the oven, filling it with smoke and heat. They didn't just want warmth, they wanted thermal mass. Thick stone walls absorbed the heat, holding it steadily for hours. After the fire burned down to embers, the ashes were swept out, the oven floor brushed clean, and the dough was slid in. Timing was everything. This method had a few magical results. First, it created even, radiant heat, which allowed the dense medieval loaves to bake thoroughly without burning. Second, it produced crusty, thick exteriors while keeping the inside tender and moist. That crust wasn't just for looks, it protected the bread from drying out and made it last longer. Imagine pulling a loaf out of that oven. The crust cracks with a satisfying crunch, steam rises from the soft interior. The smell? Nutty, earthy, slightly sweet, with a faint hint of smoke from the fire. Modern bread ovens can try, but they rarely replicate this exact mix of heat, time, and stone. Communal ovens were also social hubs. Villagers lined up with their dough, mothers, fathers, children, sometimes even travelers, all waiting their turn. They shared gossip, news, and sometimes arguments, like, "That's my loaf," or "You baked too close to my bread, it got scorched." Baking wasn't just a chore, it was community life. The shape of the loaves mattered too. Most medieval bread was round or oblong, dense and heavy. These shapes were practical. They baked evenly, were easy to transport, and could be stored for days. Fancy square loaves? Not until much later. People valued function over style. The thickness of the crust also contributed to nutrition. When the dough hits the hot stone floor, the Maillard reaction occurs, a slow, natural browning process that creates flavor compounds. It gives the bread a subtle roasted aroma and slightly caramelized taste. This crust also sealed the interior, keeping moisture and nutrients locked inside. Modern soft bread often skips this step, trading flavor and longevity for fluffiness. Baking in a wood-fired oven also brought unpredictability. Sometimes the heat was uneven. Loaves might bake faster on one side, slower on the other. Bakers adapted. They rotated the dough, adjusted placement, and learned to read the oven like it was a living thing. It was intuitive knowledge passed down through generations. And here's a bedtime thought. The oven itself gave life to the bread. The slow heat, the radiant stones, the gentle push of the fire, everything combined to transform simple dough into sustenance. Unlike modern ovens, which bake quickly and uniformly, medieval ovens added character and depth to every loaf. Even when bread got slightly overcooked, it wasn't wasted. A slightly hardened crust could be softened in soups or stews, or even ground into breadcrumbs. Waste wasn't an option. Every loaf had value. The communal aspect also influenced baking techniques. Since everyone had to share the oven, timing was synchronized. Bakers developed rhythms: fire in the morning, dough prepared while heat builds, loaves baked in batches. This rhythm wasn't stressful. It was natural, comforting. Life followed the pace of the oven, the dough, and the rising sun. And the end result? Bread that fed the poor and rich alike, that survived long journeys, that kept families full during harsh winters, and that tasted far richer than most modern loaves. The combination of whole grains, slow fermentation, and stone oven baking produced a loaf that was not only nutritious, but resilient. So, as you imagine a medieval oven tonight, picture the glowing stones, the faint smoke curling up the chimney, the warm, nutty smell filling the air, and the gentle crack of a crust as it cools. That loaf embodies centuries of wisdom, patience, and love. It's not just bread, it's history you can eat. First, let's remember, medieval bread wasn't light and airy like the soft sandwich loaves we see today. It was dense, heavy, and full of fiber. Every bite had substance. This fiber was key. Fiber helps digestion, keeps your stomach full, and even stabilizes blood sugar. Modern white bread? It's basically stripped of fiber. It goes straight to your bloodstream and spikes sugar levels, making you hungry again much faster. Medieval bread, on the other hand, kept people satisfied for hours. The grains themselves also contributed important minerals: iron, magnesium, zinc, all essential for energy, strong bones, and immune health, remained intact because the flour wasn't overprocessed. Modern milling often removes these nutrients, and then companies try to add them back, artificially. But the natural version in medieval bread was easier for the body to absorb. Then there's the protein. Ancient grains like spelt, emmer, and einkorn contained more protein than most modern wheat. This protein, combined with slow fermentation, broke down into forms that were easier to digest. People didn't just fill their stomachs, they fed their muscles, their hearts, and their brains. Farmers, soldiers, and children all relied on this steady energy. One heavy loaf could power someone through a full day of fieldwork, chopping wood or carrying water. And let's talk about fermentation again, because it was crucial. The slow, sourdough-style rise not only improved flavor, but also helped break down anti-nutrients like phytic acid in the grains. That meant iron and zinc were more available to the body. Modern fast-rise bread doesn't do this. So medieval bread literally made the nutrients in grains more accessible. Bread also acted as a carrier of calories. Life in the Middle Ages was physically demanding. Peasants worked from dawn until dusk in fields, carrying heavy loads, bending, lifting, and walking miles each day. One slice of modern white bread wouldn't sustain them. One thick slice of dense medieval bread could. It wasn't just food. It was endurance packed in a loaf. Another subtle benefit? Gut health. Thanks to the live fermentation and whole grains, medieval bread introduced natural bacteria and fiber to the digestive system. These microbes helped keep the stomach and intestines functioning properly. Modern bread, especially highly processed types, can irritate the gut for some people, especially if it contains refined wheat or additives. Medieval bread worked with the digestive system rather than stressing it. Even the crust had benefits. That thick, dark crust wasn't just for texture or flavor. It was slightly caramelized through the heat of the stone oven, creating compounds that added antioxidants. Those antioxidants help protect cells and support overall health, a nice bonus baked into every loaf. And don't forget hydration. Medieval people often ate bread with soups, stews, or porridge. That meant their meals were balanced. Fiber from the bread, nutrients from grains, and hydration from liquids. Modern bread is usually eaten dry, sometimes with butter or jam, which can lead to quick spikes in blood sugar and less satiety. Medieval bread, on the other hand, kept people satisfied for hours. Psychologically, bread also had an emotional impact. There's something calming about a heavy, wholesome loaf. Holding it in your hands, breaking it apart, sharing it with family, it gave a sense of security. It's food that says, you're fed, you're safe, you'll get through the day. In a world where hunger was a real threat, that reassurance was priceless. Even the economy of medieval bread contributed to health. Poor families could rely on simple loaves made from rye or barley, which were cheaper but just as nutritious. Wealthier families ate finer white bread made from wheat, but they didn't get the same natural fiber or fermentation benefits. The poor were accidentally healthier in some ways. Nature had designed their diet to sustain them. So medieval bread nourished people in 5 key ways. Fiber-rich, kept digestion smooth and stomachs full. Mineral-dense, iron, magnesium, zinc remained intact. Protein-rich and digestible, supported energy and muscle. Gut-friendly, live fermentation introduced helpful bacteria. And emotionally satisfying, provided comfort and reassurance. All of this came from simple ingredients: flour, water, salt, and time. No additives, no bleaching, no shortcuts. Just patience and respect for the natural process. And that's why medieval people stayed strong. They may have lacked modern medicine, gyms, or vitamins, but they had bread that genuinely fed the body from the inside out. Modern bread can't always make that claim. It's convenient, yes, but sometimes convenience comes at the expense of health. As you drift towards sleep tonight, picture a thick medieval loaf resting on a wooden table. Its crust is golden and crunchy. Inside, the dense crumb smells nutty and warm. Imagine breaking it, feeling its weight in your hands, and knowing that every bite is packed with fiber, minerals, and slow fermented goodness. That loaf isn't just food. It's history, nourishment, and comfort all in one. First, picture a typical medieval morning. Villagers woke up at dawn, often after a cold night in drafty cottages. Breakfast was simple: a thick slice of bread, maybe soaked in ale, milk, or a little butter if they were lucky. It filled the stomach, warmed the body, and gave them energy for hours of physical labor. Unlike modern sugary cereals or pastries, this bread sustained people. One bite, and they could carry firewood, tend animals, or work the fields without needing a snack every hour. Lunch wasn't much different. Travelers, laborers, and soldiers carried small loaves with them. Bread was portable, durable, and calorie-dense. A dense rye or barley loaf could survive a day in a backpack or a bag slung over a shoulder, feeding the eater with minimal fuss. Modern bread, soft and fluffy, wouldn't have survived the journey. It would crumple into sad crumbs. Even dinner leaned heavily on bread. Stews, soups, and pottages were often eaten with chunks of bread. Sometimes, bread was used as a base for meals, like a bowl made of dough to hold thick soup. Nothing went to waste. Crusts were dipped, stale loaves were softened, and every bite counted. Bread wasn't just food. It was a utensil, plate, and sustenance all in one. Bread also had social and cultural significance. Sharing bread was symbolic. Breaking bread together meant trust, friendship, and community. Guests were welcomed with bread and ale. Bread was involved in religious rituals, festivals, and even fines or payments. In some villages, loaves were used to pay rent or taxes. That's right, bread was literally money. The nutritional benefits we discussed earlier made this reliance on bread not just practical, but essential. Fiber kept digestion regular, protein fueled muscles, and minerals supported strength and health. A family's survival during harsh winters often depended on their stock of bread. Unlike modern bread, which is often eaten for convenience or taste, medieval bread kept entire communities alive. Even kids depended on bread. Kids didn't have candy or processed snacks. A loaf of rye or barley could fuel a child through a day of chores, helping them grow strong and resilient. Bread was a shared experience. Families ate together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about the day's work. It wasn't just nourishment. It was rhythm, routine, and comfort. Interestingly, medieval people recognized differences in bread quality. White wheat bread was often reserved for the wealthy. Poorer families ate rye, barley, or mixed grain breads, which were actually more nutritious in many ways. This accidental health benefit meant that the poor often had better digestion and a stronger gut than the upper classes, who relied on refined, low-fiber white bread. Nature, once again, had a subtle sense of humor. Bread also shaped work schedules and daily routines. Farmers planned their labor around the oven schedules, baking cycles, and mealtimes. Soldiers and travelers carried loaves for days, relying on their durability. Festivals and market days were timed with fresh baking, making bread a central part of social life. The rhythm of bread mirrored the rhythm of life itself. Let's not forget bread and survival during winter. In colder climates, fresh produce was scarce and meat was expensive. Bread provided calories, fiber, and essential nutrients.
Combined with soups, broths, and root vegetables, it kept people alive and healthy when other foods were scarce. A loaf of dense rye was more than comfort, it was life insurance. Bread also influenced medieval health in subtle ways. Because it was made with whole grains, fermented slowly, and eaten with other simple foods, it didn't spike blood sugar the way modern bread often does. People maintained energy throughout the day, felt fuller for longer, and avoided some digestive problems common today. In a way, medieval bread acted like a slow-release energy source, perfectly suited to the demands of their lifestyle. And humorously, bread sometimes doubled as entertainment or creativity. Bakers would stamp loaves with symbols, initials, or patterns. Kids might sneak little designs into the dough. Sharing bread was also storytelling. Who made it, whose starter was used, whose oven it baked in. Every loaf had a story. So when you think about medieval bread, remember, it wasn't just food. It was a companion, a tool, a currency, and a healer. It shaped daily life, social structures, work schedules, and even culture. Its weight, flavor, and texture were all part of a system that kept medieval communities healthy, connected, and alive. As you imagine the day ending in a small medieval village, think about families sitting together, breaking bread, passing loaves around, dipping crusts into stew, and feeling warm, satisfied, and safe. That's the power of bread, not just as food, but as the backbone of life itself.
First, let's talk ingredients. Modern bread often contains more than just flour, water, salt, and yeast. Walk down a supermarket aisle and you'll find long lists of additives, preservatives, dough conditioners, and emulsifiers. Some of these names sound like they belong in a chemistry lab instead of your stomach. Calcium propionate, enzymes, ascorbic acid, basically ingredients that weren't present in medieval bread. Why are they there? Mostly shelf life and convenience. Modern bread is designed to last weeks on a shelf without mold or spoilage. Medieval bread, it lasted a few days maximum. Anything older was turned into soup, porridge, or breadcrumbs. Modern bread sacrifices nutrition and digestion for convenience. Then there's refined flour. Today, most white bread is made from wheat stripped of bran and germ. That's where all the fiber, vitamins, and minerals go. What's left? Mostly starch. Your body digests it quickly, spiking blood sugar and insulin levels. That rapid spike can make you feel tired, hungry again soon, and sometimes bloated or gassy. Medieval bread, dense and whole, did the opposite. It released energy slowly and kept people full. Another difference is fast yeast. Modern bread rises in an hour or two thanks to commercial yeast, often boosted with sugar or additives. Quick-rise bread doesn't undergo slow fermentation. That means it misses out on all the benefits of sourdough: digestion-friendly acids, reduced anti-nutrients, and flavor complexity. Fast-rise bread is basically the instant coffee version of bread. It works fast but lacks depth. And don't forget gluten levels. Modern wheat has been bred for high gluten content. Gluten makes bread elastic, airy, and perfect for sandwich loaves, but it's often harder to digest. Medieval grains were lower in gluten, and long fermentation naturally broke down some gluten proteins, making bread gentler on the stomach. Today, many people struggle with bloating, cramps, or other digestive discomfort after eating high gluten bread. Sugar is another sneaky factor. Many modern breads, even basic sandwich loaves, contain added sugar, just enough to feed yeast, improve browning, and enhance flavor. Medieval bread had no sugar, only the natural sweetness from the grain. That extra sugar contributes to blood sugar spikes, weight gain, and sometimes that groggy, post-bread feeling. Modern processing also kills beneficial bacteria. Sourdough starters introduce natural microbes that aid digestion. Fast-rise commercial bread contains none of these. Your gut misses out on that gentle pre-digestion, making modern bread heavier on the system. And let's talk chemicals and preservatives. Calcium propionate, for example, prevents mold but can cause gut irritation in some people. Dough conditioners improve texture but sometimes irritate the digestive system.
Modern bread is designed to survive supermarket shelves, not to nurture the body. Texture matters too. Soft, fluffy bread may feel comforting, but it's digested almost instantly. Medieval bread's dense crumb, chewy texture, and thick crust slowed digestion, creating a steady energy release. Modern bread gives a quick burst, then a crash. Your body says, "Wait, I'm hungry again?" And your brain adds a little complaint too: sluggishness, fog, and bloating. There's also lack of nutrients. Milling removes minerals, refining removes fiber, bleaching removes vitamins, and enrichment only partially replaces them. The result? Bread that fills the stomach but does very little to feed the body properly. Medieval bread, in contrast, kept nutrients intact through stone grinding, whole grains, and slow fermentation. Even additives can affect gut health. Preservatives, emulsifiers, and conditioners alter gut bacteria in subtle ways, sometimes leading to inflammation, bloating, or digestive discomfort. Medieval bread avoided all of this because it relied solely on natural ingredients and slow fermentation. Humorously, modern bread is like a fancy Instagram influencer: polished, pretty, soft, and consistent, but often hollow inside. Medieval bread? Rough, unpredictable, sometimes cracked, but packed with substance. One nourished you, the other sometimes just satisfied your cravings temporarily. So, when you eat modern bread and feel sluggish, bloated, or unsatisfied, it's not just your imagination. Industrial processing, refined flour, added sugar, fast yeast, preservatives, and high gluten all contribute. Medieval bread did the opposite: natural, slow, nutrient rich, gut friendly. As you imagine this tonight, picture a dense, earthy loaf of medieval bread versus a soft, pale, uniform supermarket loaf. One feeds, strengthens, and sustains. The other, well, it fills you fast, then leaves your stomach a little confused.
First, let's define the stars of the show. Bran is the outer layer of the grain, tough, earthy, and full of nutrients. Fiber comes largely from bran and other whole grain components, and it's basically the broom that sweeps your digestive system clean. Medieval bread included both in abundance because the grains were stone ground and the whole kernel was used. Modern white bread? The bran is stripped away. Poof, gone. Fiber does a lot of jobs. It slows digestion, so blood sugar rises steadily instead of spiking and crashing. It keeps you full for hours, which is essential when your day involves plowing fields, carrying buckets of water, or hauling sacks of grain. Medieval peasants probably didn't think in terms of blood sugar, but they sure noticed that hearty bread kept them energized all day. Bran is also loaded with minerals like iron, magnesium, and zinc. These minerals help the body produce energy, maintain strong bones, and fight off infections. Medieval bread was essentially a natural multivitamin delivered one slice at a time. Modern bread? Mostly empty calories with some synthetic vitamins added back in. It's like putting a sticker that says healthy on a candy bar. Fiber also acts as a prebiotic. That means it feeds the good bacteria in your gut. Medieval bread, with all its fiber and live fermentation, supported a healthy microbiome. Your stomach and intestines would thank you quietly every day. Modern bread, especially refined white bread, offers little to no prebiotic support, and additives may even disrupt gut bacteria. And let's not forget digestion. Fiber absorbs water, creating bulk in the intestines, which helps mood along smoothly. Medieval people avoided constipation, bloating, and stomach discomfort largely because of this. Modern bread, soft and stripped, moves through too quickly or sometimes just sits in the digestive system in ways that create discomfort. There's also satiety, that satisfying feeling of fullness. Medieval bread had substance. One thick slice could replace several slices of modern sandwich bread. It allowed people to eat less frequently but maintain energy. That's an overlooked factor in overall health. People weren't grazing every hour. They ate, worked, rested, and repeated. Humorously, medieval bread often had texture surprises because of the bran.
little nubs, bits of grain, sometimes even small stones left from milling. Modern bread is polished, uniform, and almost suspiciously soft. The medieval loaf demanded chewing. Your jaw got a workout. Your brain felt satisfaction. Every bite felt earned. Fiber and bran also slowed the absorption of starches. That means medieval people didn't experience the sugar crashes that many modern bread eaters do. Their energy levels stayed steady, perfect for a full day of work. Modern bread often leaves people hungry again in an hour, wondering why their snack didn't last. Even the thick crust contributed to fiber. Stone ovens baked a hard, flavorful exterior that wasn't just for taste. It added a little more chew, a little more texture, and a little more fiber with every bite. Modern soft bread? Crust is thin, flavor is light, fiber is minimal. It's all fluff. Another point, medieval people didn't wash fiber away with sugary spreads. Bread was eaten mostly plain, with stews, soups, or cheese. The fiber did its work naturally. Modern bread is often smothered in butter, jam, or processed spreads, which can counteract the subtle health benefits the bread itself might have offered. Fiber and bran also improved the taste and complexity of the bread. That nutty, earthy flavor comes directly from the whole grain. Medieval people may not have called it complex carbohydrates, but they appreciated the flavor. Modern white bread? Bland, pale, predictable. You need extra toppings to make it interesting. In short, medieval bread's fiber and bran were quiet heroes, helping digestion, stabilizing energy, feeding gut bacteria, adding minerals, creating satiety, and enhancing flavor. They worked together seamlessly. Modern bread often leaves these heroes on the cutting room floor. As you picture this tonight, imagine breaking apart a thick, dense medieval loaf. You feel the texture, taste the nutty flavor, and feel that slow-release energy. That's fiber and bran doing their quiet, essential job. First, let's remember, medieval bread was nutrient-dense, whole grains, slowly fermented, stone ground. This bread retained minerals like iron, magnesium, and zinc, as well as vitamins from the germ. These nutrients are essential for producing energy, maintaining bones, and supporting the immune system. A regular diet of hearty bread helped medieval people endure long workdays and harsh conditions. Modern bread, especially white, refined varieties, lacks most of these natural nutrients. The slow fermentation we've discussed wasn't just about flavor, it also improved digestion. Over time, this meant fewer gastrointestinal issues, better nutrient absorption, and overall gut health. A healthy gut influences nearly every system in the body, from immunity to mood regulation. Medieval bread contributed to this naturally. Modern quick-rise bread, stripped of fiber and beneficial microbes, can sometimes stress the digestive system instead. Bread also provided steady energy. Dense, high-fiber loaves released calories gradually, unlike modern processed bread, which often spikes blood sugar and leads to crashes. This slow release supported endurance for farmers, laborers, and children, helping them maintain strength and stamina over the long term. One surprisingly important benefit was resilience against disease. Iron-rich bread helped prevent anemia. Nutrient-dense grains supported overall immunity. The combination of fiber, minerals, and slowly released energy helped people survive not just hunger, but the seasonal illnesses that frequently swept through villages. Bread wasn't medicine in the modern sense, but it functioned like it. Even mental and emotional health played a role. A steady, filling diet provided comfort and reassurance. Knowing that bread was available for meals reduced anxiety about food scarcity. Families shared loaves, dipped them in soups or stews, and enjoyed a rhythm of eating that brought structure and stability. That sense of security is a subtle but real contribution to long-term well-being. Another key point, medieval bread helped prevent malnutrition. Even poor families with only rye or barley loaves got fiber, protein, and minerals in every bite. The natural fermentation reduced anti-nutrients, ensuring minerals like iron and zinc were absorbed efficiently. Modern bread often requires enrichment to add nutrients back artificially, and it still rarely matches the bioavailability of the natural version. There's also the resilience factor. Dense, long-lasting loaves allowed families to survive winters and poor harvests. Stale bread could be softened in soups or stews or used as a thickener. Nothing went to waste. Every bite contributed to health over days and weeks, not just one meal. And humorously, medieval bread even had built-in exercise. Dense loaves required chewing, which stimulated saliva, aided digestion, and trained the jaw muscles. Modern soft bread barely engages the mouth, soft, airy, and easy to swallow. It's convenient, but less functional. Finally, consider community health. Shared ovens, collective baking, and communal meals ensured that everyone had access to sustenance. Bread connected people, and the consistent availability of nutrient-dense food reduced the risk of starvation and deficiency across the village. Modern society often forgets the importance of community in nutrition, something medieval bread provided naturally. So, medieval bread wasn't just food, it was long-term health insurance baked into everyday life. Dense, fermented, fiber-rich loaves helped people survive, thrive, and pass on generations of resilience. It nourished the body, supported the mind, and strengthened the community. Modern bread, fast, refined, and additive-laden, has lost most of these benefits. As you imagine this tonight, picture villagers breaking bread together, sharing loaves, dipping crusts into warm stew, and knowing they were being sustained in ways that went far beyond hunger. That's the quiet power of medieval bread, subtle, unassuming, and profoundly effective.
First, let's picture a small village. Morning sunlight filters through thatched roofs. The baker's fire is glowing, smoke curling from the chimney. Families bring their dough to the communal oven, chatting, laughing, sometimes bickering over whose loaf baked first. Bread brought people together. Sharing oven space meant sharing life, gossip, and community news. The oven was as much a social hub as it was a source of nourishment. Bread also carried symbolic weight. Breaking bread together signified trust and friendship. Guests were welcomed with bread and ale. In churches, bread was central to religious rituals, symbolizing life, sustenance, and spiritual connection. Festivals featured bread in every shape and size, from plain loaves to decorated, stamped creations. One loaf could carry both practical and symbolic meaning in a single bite. Even in markets, bread played a central role. Bakers competed not just on taste, but on shape, crust, and flavor. Villagers could identify a baker by the unique markings pressed into the dough. These thumbprints and stamps were like signatures, a sign of pride and identity. Your bread wasn't anonymous. It belonged to you and your family. Modern bread, uniform, polished, and indistinguishable. Medieval bread told a story. Bread also reflected social hierarchy. White wheat loaves were often reserved for the wealthy, while rye and barley nourished the poor. But interestingly, the poorer bread, dense, whole grain, slow fermented, was often healthier. Social status influenced flavor and refinement, but not necessarily nutrition. Bread was a subtle reminder of how culture, economy, and health intersected. Humorously, bread even influenced arguments and negotiations. You took too long in the oven. Your loaf scorched my crust. Villagers cared about their bread, and disputes over communal baking were real. Bread was serious business, but also a source of laughter, frustration, and shared experience. In everyday life, bread structured the rhythm of the day. Meals began and ended with it. Work schedules, festivals, market days, and religious celebrations all revolved around loaves. Bread was both nourishment and timekeeper, a comforting, edible companion marking life's cycles. Even children learned culture through bread. They watched kneading, stamping, and baking. They learned patience as dough rose slowly over hours. They learned sharing as loaves were passed and divided.
And sometimes they even got creative, pressing designs or initials into dough. Bread taught practical skills, social norms, and creativity, all while feeding the body. In harsh times, bread symbolized survival. A family with loaves stored for winter had security. Communities depended on bakers to provide sustenance. Bread wasn't luxury, it was life. It reinforced the bonds that allowed societies to endure through famine, disease, and laborious seasons. Culturally, bread influenced language, art, and tradition. Proverbs, sayings, and idioms often featured bread, reflecting its importance. Break bread, meaning to share, or breadwinner, referring to the family provider, both originate in the centrality of bread in daily life. Art and festivals celebrated loaves in symbolic and literal ways. Bread shaped thought, ritual, and culture, not just diets. So, medieval bread was much more than a food staple. It was a connector between people, between families, between work and rest, between survival and celebration. It was a teacher. Patience, skill, sharing, and respect for time. It was a legacy, passed down through starters, recipes, and traditions that shaped communities. When you imagine a medieval village tonight, picture families gathered around tables, warm loaves in hand. The scent of crust fills the air. Children press tiny symbols into dough. Neighbors share gossip, laughter, and loaves. The oven glows in the distance, a silent witness to the rhythm of life. Bread sustains bodies, hearts, and communities all at once. And that perhaps is the final secret of medieval bread. It nourished more than just the body, it nourished social bonds, culture, and life itself. Modern bread might fill your stomach quickly, but medieval bread, it fed generations, inside and out. So, as you drift to sleep tonight, imagine that dense, earthy loaf resting on a wooden table, its crust warm and golden, its aroma comforting. Every bite is history, every crumb a story, and in those stories, we can taste a simpler, slower, healthier way of living, one loaf at a time.